The wind in the Oregon mountains was a cruel thing. It didn't just whistle through the pines, it screamed. A high, lonesome sound that clawed at the seams of the stagecoach and seeped through the floorboards like icy water. For 2 days, Catherine Maynard had felt it in her bones, a deep, resonant chill that no amount of worn wool could ward off. The coach smelled of wet leather, stale sweat, and the faint, metallic scent of fear from the man who'd gotten off at the last pass, his face as white as the snow-choked valley below. Now, there was only her, the driver, and the relentless shriek of the wind. When the dim scattered lights of Shady Hollow finally appeared through the swirling snow, they looked less like a promise of comfort and more like forgotten embers on the verge of being snuffed out. The stage lurched to a halt before a long, 2-story building whose sign hanging from one hinge might have once read Ruth's Boarding and Livery. Now, the letters were ghosts under a thick shroud of ice. Catherine paid the driver, her gloved fingers stiff and clumsy with the coins. He grunted, not meeting her eyes, already turning his attention to the exhausted horses. She was used to it. Men rarely met her eyes. Not directly, at 6 feet tall, with shoulders that spoke of a life of labor rather than leisure. She was an imposition, an inconvenient fact of nature in a world that preferred its women small and decorative. She pulled her worn leather satchel from the boot, its weight familiar and grounding, and made her way to the door. The porch groaned under her boots, each step a complaint against the cold. She stood for a moment, gathering the last of her strength, her breath pluming in the frigid air. Then, she raised a hand and knocked. It wasn't the tentative rap of a desperate woman, but 3 solid, measured thuds. The knock of someone who had a right to shelter, even if she had to pay for it. The door creaked open a few inches, revealing a sliver of a woman with a face as wrinkled as a dried apple and eyes that were surprisingly sharp and clear. A cloud of warm air, thick with the smell of roasting meat and wood smoke, billowed out and enveloped Catherine like a benediction. "Help you?" the woman asked, her voice raspy but not unkind. "I'm looking for a room. Just for the night," Catherine said. Her own voice was lower than most women's, a practical, steady tone that had been the source of much consternation in her past. The old woman, presumably Ruth, squinted, taking in Catherine's height, her plain, travel-stained dress, and the determined set of her jaw. She gave a slow, assessing nod, as if weighing a cut of beef at the butcher's. "Got one room left, by the stairs. Can be drafty." "A draft is better than a blizzard," Catherine replied simply. "I can pay." "Well, come in then before you let the whole winter in with you." Ruth opened the door wider. "Wipe your feet. I run a clean house." The warmth that washed over Catherine as she stepped inside was so profound it was almost painful. Her frozen limbs began to ache and tingle. The front room was simple, a few sturdy chairs, a braided rug worn thin in the center, and a stone fireplace where a low fire sputtered. But Ruth gestured her past it. "Kitchen's the warmest place. Supper's on the stove. You look half-starved." Catherine followed her down a short hall. The kitchen was the heart of the house, a large, low-beamed room dominated by a massive cast-iron stove that radiated heat in waves. A long wooden table sat in the center, scrubbed pale from years of use. A pot of stew bubbled on the stove, its rich aroma filling the air. And it was there, in the flickering lamplight, that she saw him. He was sitting at the far end of the table, his back to the wall. He was a big man, not just tall but broad across the shoulders. The worn flannel of his shirt stretched taut over his frame. His hat, stained with sweat and snow, rested on the table beside a half-empty tin cup. His head was bent in concentration over his left hand, which he was methodically wrapping with a strip of what looked like torn linen. The cloth was already darkening with a deep, crimson stain. As Catherine stepped into the room, he looked up. It was not a glance, but a collision. His eyes, the color of a sky before a storm, A turbulent, mesmerizing blue-gray met hers. There was no surprise in them, no judgment, just a quiet, unnerving stillness. It was the look of a man who saw things as they were, without varnish or sentiment. He took in her height, her weary face, the professional weight of the satchel in her hand, and gave a barely perceptible nod, as if he'd been expecting her, or someone like her. Catherine felt a strange jolt, a flicker of recognition for a soul as guarded as her own. She broke the gaze first, her attention drawn to a small figure huddled in a chair by the stove. Wrapped in a thick horse blanket, it was a boy, no older than 10, his face pale and streaked with grime, his eyes wide and frightened. One of his trouser legs had been cut away, revealing a crude bandage on his calf. "Boone, you get that hand seen to," Ruth clucked, moving toward the stove. "Don't you go dripping on my floor." The man Boone didn't answer his landlady. His gaze followed Catherine's to the boy. "He's resting," he said, his voice a low baritone, rough around the edges like weathered granite. It was the kind of voice that wasn't used for idle chatter. "Found him up on the North Ridge," Ruth explained, ladling stew into a bowl for Catherine. "His pa's a trapper. Looks like the boy took a nasty fall near one of the traps. Boone here carried him all the way back, 5 miles, in this storm." Catherine set her satchel on the table with a heavy thud. The weariness of the road was forgotten, replaced by the familiar, sharp focus of her trade. She looked from the boy's pale face to Boone's bleeding hand, her mind already assessing, cataloging. "The boy should be looked at properly," she said, her voice clear and steady. "And that hand needs stitches, not just a wrap." Boone finally looked down at his own hand. As if noticing it for the first time, he flexed his bloody fingers. "It'll keep." His attention was solely on the child. "It's his leg, a deep gash." "Let me see," Catherine said. It wasn't a request. She moved to the boy's side, kneeling on the floorboards that were warm from the stove. "Hello there," she said softly, her voice losing its hard edge. "My name is Catherine. I'm a nurse. Can I take a look at your leg? I promise to be gentle." The boy flinched but nodded, clutching the blanket tighter. Catherine carefully unwound the makeshift bandage. The cut was long and deep, oozing sluggishly, the edges raw and angry. It was dirty, full of pine needles and grime, but the bleeding had slowed. It was a serious wound, but one she had seen and treated 100 times before. She worked without hesitation, her movements economical and sure. From her satchel, she produced carbolic soap, clean linens, a bottle of whiskey for sterilizing, and a formidable-looking needle and suture thread. Ruth brought her a basin of hot water, her sharp eyes missing nothing. Throughout it all, Boone Calhoun remained at the table, silent. He didn't move, didn't speak, but Catherine could feel his eyes on her. It wasn't the leering gaze she sometimes endured from lonely men on the frontier, nor the suspicious stare of townsfolk. It was a quiet, intense scrutiny. He watched her hands as she cleaned the wound with firm, practiced strokes. He watched the way she spoke to the boy in a low, calming murmur, her large frame seeming to shield him from the world. He was watching a craftsman at her work, and in his stillness, she felt not judgment, but a kind of solemn respect. It was this that unnerved her more than anything. The people in Arizona, the congregation led by Pastor Merrick, had called her unnatural. Her hands were too steady, her demeanor too calm. She lacked the performative feminine fragility they expected. They had whispered that a woman so unfazed by blood and pain was a woman without a soft heart. Their judgment had been a constant, buzzing noise. Boone's silence was a vast, empty canyon in comparison, and she found it far more profound. After she had stitched the boy's leg with small, neat sutures and applied a clean dressing, she gave him a spoonful of laudanum for the pain. His eyelids were already drooping. "He'll sleep now," she announced, rising to her feet, her knees cracking in protest. "He needs to be kept warm. The wound must be kept clean. He's lost blood, but he's strong. He'll mend. Ruth nodded, a look of deep approval on her face. You have a gift, child. A true gift. She looked over at Boone. Now, it's your turn. Let the nurse see to that hand. Boone looked as if he might argue, a stubborn set to his jaw. But then his gaze met Catherine's again over the sleeping boy. He held it for a long moment. Then, slowly, he unwrapped the blood-soaked linen from his hand. The cut was jagged, running across his knuckles, deep enough to show the pale glint of bone. Without a word, he pushed the chair out beside him. It was an invitation. Catherine picked up her satchel and moved to the table, the quiet rhythm of her work taking over once more. The world shrank to the circle of lamplight, the smell of antiseptic, and the large, calloused hand resting in hers. His skin was rough, scarred from 100 other, smaller battles with rope and wood and wire, but he held it perfectly still as she cleaned and stitched the wound. His formidable presence contained in an absolute, unwavering stillness. He didn't so much as flinch when the needle pierced his skin. He just watched her face, his expression unreadable, his storm-colored eyes searching for something she couldn't name. The only sound in the kitchen was the crackle of the fire, the soft whistle of the wind finding a crack in the window frame, and the steady, quiet breathing of the sleeping child. In that small pocket of warmth, surrounded by a world of howling ice and snow, a wounded boy slept, and a silent cowboy let a strange, tall woman mend his broken flesh. The world was born new and silent in the morning. The storm had blown itself out, leaving behind a profound quiet, the kind that follows a fever breaking. Catherine woke to a room painted in the soft, blue-white light of reflected snow. For a moment, she didn't know where she was, the scent of pine and cold. Clean air filled her lungs. Then it came back to her, the boarding house, the biting wind, the boy, and the man with eyes the color of a coming storm. She rose from the narrow bed, the floorboards cold beneath her bare feet. A pitcher of water on the washstand had a thin sheet of ice on its surface. She broke it with a finger and splashed the frigid water on her face, the shock of it chasing away the last vestiges of sleep. Dressing quickly in the chill, she plaited her long, dark hair into a single, practical braid that fell down her back. Her movements were deft and efficient, honed by years of rising before the sun in places that were not her own. Her first thought was of the boy. She picked up her leather satchel and left the room, her stockinged feet making no sound in the hallway. The main room was empty. The fire from the night before, a bed of glowing orange embers. The deep quiet of the house was broken only by the rhythmic ticking of a grandfather clock in the corner. When she pushed open the kitchen door, she expected to find it empty as well. But he was there. Boone Calhoun sat at the long table in the exact same spot as the night before, a tin cup of coffee held loosely in his uninjured right hand. He wasn't drinking it. He was simply sitting, his gaze fixed on the chair by the stove where the boy, Jacob, lay sleeping soundly under a mountain of quilts. Boone had kept the watch. He looked up as she entered, and the same jolt went through her as before. In the clear morning light, his eyes seemed to hold the vast, empty loneliness of the winter landscape itself. He gave her a short, single nod of acknowledgement. It wasn't a greeting so much as a confirmation that he saw her, that her presence was a fact he had registered. "How is he?" she asked, her voice hushed. "Quiet all night," Boone replied. His voice in the silent room was a low rumble. Stirred once, didn't cry out. She approached the boy's makeshift bed. He was breathing deeply and evenly, a healthy flush returning to his pale cheeks. She laid a hand on his forehead. There was no fever. Gently. She lifted the edge of the quilts to inspect her work. The bandage was clean. "I'll need to change the dressing," she said, more to herself than to him. Boone said nothing, but he watched. He watched as she retrieved her things, as she poured warm water from the kettle on the stove into the basin, as she laid out fresh linen. He watched her hands as she unwrapped the bandage with a touch that was impossibly gentle for someone of her size and strength. The stitches were clean, the skin around them only slightly inflamed. There was no sign of festering. She worked with a focused intensity that left no room for anything else. Jacob stirred and whimpered as she cleaned the wound, his eyes fluttering open. "It's all right," Catherine murmured, not looking up from her task. "It's just me, the nurse. We're just making you clean so you can heal up strong. You were very brave yesterday." The boy relaxed under her voice. He watched her with the solemn, trusting eyes of a child who has been shown true kindness in the face of pain. When she was finished, she gave him a small piece of jerky from her own dwindling supplies, and he gnawed on it gratefully. All the while, Boone's gaze never left her. He wasn't watching her face or her form. He was watching her hands. He was watching the sureness of their movements, the way they never fumbled, never hesitated. He was witnessing a competence so absolute it was like a force of nature. Catherine had felt men's eyes on her whole life, but never like this. It was a gaze that was not interested in what she was, but in what she could do. It was unnerving and, in a way she couldn't yet admit, deeply comforting. A little while later, Ruth bustled into the kitchen, her face rosy from the cold, a basket of eggs in her hand. "Slept like the dead, the both of you," she announced cheerfully. "And the boy, too, that's your doing. I've no doubt you have a healer's touch. Now, breakfast for the three of you. A storm like that gives a body an appetite." Soon, the kitchen was filled with the sizzle of bacon and the smell of strong coffee. Ruth set 3 plates on the table, and Catherine sat, feeling a strange reluctance to break the quiet communion that had existed between herself, the silent cowboy, and the sleeping child. Ruth was a talker, a woman who filled silences as naturally as she filled coffee cups. She spoke of past winters, of the trapper who was Jacob's father, a good but solitary man named Elias, and of how Boone was the one who always kept an eye out for the folks living on the wild edges of the territory. "He's a good man, our Boone," she said, sliding a plate of eggs and bacon in front of Catherine, quiet as a shadow, but solid as the mountain. "He doesn't say much, but what he says, he means." Boone didn't acknowledge the praise, his attention fixed on his plate. Catherine ate, the hot food a balm to her weary body. For a brief moment, sitting in the warm kitchen, she allowed herself to feel a sense of peace. It was a dangerous feeling, one she had learned to distrust. Peace was temporary, safety was an illusion. "We are so blessed you were on that stage, dear," Ruth continued, sitting down with her own cup of coffee. "A true godsend. We never did get your name, though." The question, however kindly meant, landed like a stone in a quiet pool. Catherine's hand stilled, her fork hovering over her plate. The air thickened. A name was a history. A name was a chain, linking you to a past, to a place, to people who could point a finger and judge. Her name had been spoken from a pulpit in Arizona, tied to words like prideful, unwomanly, and disobedient. The memory was a fresh brand on her soul. She set her fork down carefully. "You can call me nurse," she said, her voice even, but a wall had gone up behind her eyes. "It's what I answer to." Ruth blinked, a flicker of confusion on her kindly face. It was a clear deflection, a polite but firm closing of a door. A good woman of the church would have shared her name, her family, her story. Catherine's refusal, however quiet, marked her as other. An uncomfortable silence descended on the table, broken only by the crackle of the stove. Ruth looked as if she wanted to press, her natural curiosity warring with her manners. It was Boone who broke the standoff. He had been watching her, his gaze steady. He had seen the subtle shift in her posture, the way she braced herself as if for a blow. He lifted his head and looked at her, his storm-gray eyes cutting through the social awkwardness, straight to the heart of the matter. "Name doesn't matter," he said, his voice low and certain. He paused, holding both her gaze and Ruth's. Then he added, with a finality that allowed no argument. Long as her hands can save a man. The words hung in the air. Simple, direct, and more powerful than any sermon. It was not a compliment. It was a statement of fact. A declaration of value. He was not asking for her story. He was telling her that her story was irrelevant. What mattered was the skill in her hands, the thing she had just proven. He had stripped away all the layers of judgment, her height, her plainness, her lack of feminine softness, her hidden past, and acknowledged the one thing that was undeniably true. She was a healer. Catherine felt the tension in her shoulders release, a breath she hadn't realized she was holding escaping her lips, the heat of a blush, something she hadn't felt in years, rose in her cheeks. She looked down at her hands, resting on the table. They were large, capable, and currently they were trembling ever so slightly. Ruth looked from Boone to Catherine, and a slow look of understanding dawned on her face. She gave a small, wise nod and turned her attention back to her coffee. The subject closed. The rest of the meal passed in a comfortable quiet. The unspoken was now understood. Catherine Maynard, or whoever she was, carried a heavy past, and Boone Calhoun, the silent cowboy, had just stood between her and the need to explain it. He hadn't offered pity or charity. He had offered something far rarer and far more valuable to a woman like her: respect, pure and unvarnished. She risked a glance at him. He was eating his breakfast, his movements measured and calm, his stitched-up hand resting on the table. He did not look at her again. He did not need to. He had already spoken, and in the vast, echoing silence of his nature, those few words had been enough. For the first time since she'd been cast out of the sun-scorched world of Arizona, Catherine felt something other than the cold weight of loneliness. She felt seen. By the next morning, the world outside Ruth's boarding house had settled into a state of sharp, brilliant clarity. The sun, a pale disk in a vast blue sky, struck dazzling glints off a landscape buried in pristine snow. The air was thin and bitingly cold, so clean it felt like inhaling shards of glass. It was a good day to travel. The roads would be passable, if slow. Catherine had packed her few belongings back into her satchel before the sun was fully risen. Her plan had always been to keep moving, a planet in a lonely orbit, never staying long enough for gravity to take hold. Attachment was a complication, and scrutiny was a danger. Shady Hollow, with its brief offering of warmth and its silent, observant cowboy, was a place she needed to put behind her. Her work here was done. The boy, Jacob, was recovering well, his father having arrived late the previous day, a gaunt, weather-beaten man whose gratitude was as silent and profound as Boone's respect. She came down the stairs to find Ruth in the main room, sweeping the hearth. Catherine placed the coins for her lodging and 2 meals on the mantelpiece. "Thank you for your hospitality, Mrs. Ruth," she said, her voice formal. It was a comfortable stay. Ruth stopped her sweeping and looked at Catherine, a knowing sadness in her old eyes. "You're leaving then, so soon?" "It's time for me to be on my way," Catherine stated simply. There was no room for argument in her tone. Before Ruth could reply, the front door burst open, letting in a swirl of frigid air. A man stood panting on the threshold, his face etched with worry. It was Mr. Abernathy, who ran the town's general store. He was a small, fussy man, and his distress was palpable. "Ruth, it's Martha's boy, little Tim," he gasped, his eyes wide. "He's burning up. The fever's taken him something fierce. And old Mrs. Gable from down the lane. She can't hardly draw a breath." Ruth's hand went to her mouth. "The grip. It's spreading faster than I thought." She looked at Mr. Abernathy. Then her gaze shot to Catherine, her expression a mixture of desperation and inspiration. "Wait, we have..." Catherine felt a familiar cold dread snake its way up her spine. She knew what was coming. She took a half step toward the door, her satchel feeling like a lead weight in her hand. "I'm sorry to hear of your town's troubles," she said, her voice carefully neutral. "I wish you well." "Wish us well, mister," Abernathy sputtered, finally noticing her. He looked from her imposing height to Ruth. "Who is this?" At that moment, the kitchen door opened and Boone Calhoun stepped into the room. He had a heavy winter coat on and was pulling on his gloves. He stopped when he saw the scene, his blue-gray eyes taking everything in with a single, sweeping glance. Abernathy's panic, Ruth's pleading expression, and Catherine's rigid, defensive posture. "This is the nurse I told you about," Ruth said quickly, stepping forward. "The one who stitched up young Jacob and Boone's hand. She's a miracle worker." The store owner's eyes widened as he looked at Catherine again, this time with a dawning hope. "A nurse, Lord. We need— Dr. Miller is down with it himself," and his hands shake so badly from age he can't hardly hold a spoon, let alone a needle. The informal town council was now in session, with Catherine as the unwilling subject. More people began to trickle in, drawn by the commotion. A blacksmith with soot on his brow, 2 women wrapped in heavy shawls, their faces pinched with fear. They all stopped and stared at her. Their gazes were heavy things. She could feel them measuring her, dissecting her. She was too tall. Her height was the first thing they saw, an affront to the natural order. Her face, handsome but severe and unsmiling, was too cold. When she spoke, her voice was too direct, lacking the gentle, roundabout soft talk of their women. She could almost hear the words forming in their minds, strange, unnatural. Not one of us. They were desperate, but their desperation was laced with a deep, instinctual suspicion of anything that did not fit their narrow view of the world. "I am a traveling nurse," Catherine said, forcing herself to meet their stares without flinching. "I was only passing through." "But you can't," one of the women cried out. "My little girl started coughing this morning, a terrible, hacking sound. We have no one." The room was filled with a chorus of worried pleas and frightened murmurs. Catherine stood like a stone in the middle of a rushing river, unmoved. Pity was a trap. Involvement was a cage. She had built her walls high and thick for a reason. She was about to give her final, polite refusal when Boone spoke. "The logging camp to the north," he said, his deep voice cutting through the chatter, silencing the room instantly. "They lost 3 men to this sickness last week. 10 more are down. It's a bad strain. It settles in the lungs." He wasn't talking to the townsfolk. He was talking directly to Catherine. He was giving her facts, not pleas. He was laying out the reality of the situation, appealing not to her heart, but to her knowledge. He took a step closer. "I deliver their payroll and bring back supplies, medicine, when they have any. I was just about to ride up." He paused, his gaze steady and unwavering. "Abernathy can clear out the back room of the store for you. A place to work. Ruth will give you your room and board. The town will pay 50 cents a day, plus $1 for every patient you see." It was a proposition, not a request, clean, simple, and practical. A business arrangement. He had understood, in a way no one else could, that she would not be swayed by emotional appeals. She could not be bought with guilt or pity, but she could be hired. He had offered her a way to stay that did not require her to be a savior or an angel of mercy. It allowed her to simply be what she was, a professional. The townspeople looked at Boone, then back at Catherine, waiting. Their need was a palpable force in the room, a heavy blanket of fear and hope. But their judgment was there too, in the tight set of their mouths and the narrowness of their eyes. If she stayed, she would be under a microscope. Every action, every word, every success and every failure would be noted and whispered about over fences and dinner tables. Catherine looked past them all, her gaze locking with Boone's. In his eyes, she saw none of the town's suspicion. She saw no expectation that she be anything other than what he had already seen, a pair of steady hands that could save a man. He had seen her value, and he was not asking her to change or soften or smile to make it more palatable to others. The memory of Arizona, of the accusations and the shame, rose in her mind. Pastor Merrick's voice, telling her that her lack of a gentle spirit was a sin against God. The faces of the women, turning away from her in pious disapproval. She had run from that judgment for 2 years. She had crossed mountains and deserts to escape it. But here, now, was a different kind of challenge. Not to run, but to stand, to exist as she was, without apology, to let her work, the skill in her hands, be her only testament, to face their whispers and their stares and prove them wrong, not with words, but with deeds. It was a fearsome thought, and yet the idea of getting on that next stagecoach, of returning to the lonely road, suddenly felt like a retreat, not a liberation. She drew in a slow, deep breath of the cold morning air. "The room at the store will need a stove," she said, her voice clear and strong, ringing with an authority that made Mr. Abernathy jump, "and a sturdy table. I'll need a constant supply of hot water, clean linens, and every bottle of whiskey and carbolic soap you have in stock. I will see my first patient in 1 hour." A collective sigh of relief went through the room. The women began to whisper excitedly. The men nodded in approval. They had their nurse. But Catherine was not looking at them. She was looking at Boone Calhoun. He had not smiled, she suspected he rarely did, but for a fleeting second, the hard line of his mouth seemed to soften. He gave her another one of his short, economical nods. It was a nod of agreement, of confirmation, a silent acknowledgement of the pact they had just forged. He turned and walked out the door without another word, off to ride to the northern logging camp. He had done his part. He had anchored her to this place. Catherine stood her ground in the center of the room, the new focus of every eye in Shady Hollow. She felt their stares, their hope, and their deep-seated distrust. She was too tall, too cold, too direct. She was everything they were not. And for the first time in a very long time, Catherine Maynard did not turn and run. She would not retreat. The days that followed bled into one another, a relentless, exhausting rhythm of sickness and struggle. The back room of Abernathy's general store became Catherine's entire world, a small kingdom of cots, basins, and the ever-present, cloying smell of illness. The winter grip, as Boone had warned, was a cruel and tenacious beast. It settled deep in the lungs, turning breath into a ragged, painful labor. Catherine worked until her bones ached and her vision blurred. She moved from cot to cot, a tall, steady presence in the flickering lamplight. She spooned broth into fevered mouths, changed sweat-soaked linens, and listened to the rasping coughs that echoed in the cramped space. The townspeople, in their fear, had ceded this territory to her. They left food and firewood on the porch of the store, rarely daring to enter. They watched her from a distance when she emerged, blinking in the harsh winter light, to draw a bucket of clean water. Their suspicion had not vanished. It had simply been overshadowed by their desperation. They whispered about her. They said she never seemed to tire. They said she could look at a dying man without flinching. They said her hands, which could set a bone or stitch a wound with such precision, were unnatural for a woman. They saw her competence, but they mistook her composure for coldness. They could not comprehend that her stillness was a shield, the only thing that allowed her to stand day after day on the front lines of a war against death. Of Boone Calhoun, she saw little, but she felt his presence. He was a current moving just beneath the surface of the town's life. She would see him riding out at dawn, a string of pack horses behind him, heading north to the logging camps, sometimes, late at night. She'd hear the heavy tread of his boots on the porch and emerge to find a fresh side of venison or a sack of potatoes that hadn't been there before. He never waited for thanks. He never sought her out. His support was like his character, silent, practical, and solid as the mountains that surrounded them. One evening, 3 weeks into the siege, the world seemed to give up. A new storm rolled in, heavier and more vicious than the last. The wind howled with a maddened fury, piling snow in great sculpted drifts that buried fences and blotted out the road. And then, one by one, the lights in Shady Hollow went out. The town's meager supply of lamp oil, already rationed, was gone. The world outside Catherine's window dissolved into a maelstrom of impenetrable, roaring blackness. Inside her infirmary, she had one last lamp burning, its flame sputtering low. Her patients, only 5 now, the worst of the grip having passed, were sleeping fitfully. She checked on each one, her shadow a looming giant on the wall. When the last of the oil was gone, the flame shrank to a tiny blue bead and vanished, plunging the room into absolute darkness. The only light, the only warmth, came from the small pot-bellied stove in the corner, its grated door casting a faint, trembling orange glow. It was not enough. The cold was already creeping back into the room, a tangible, predatory thing. She looked at her woodbox. It was nearly empty. A profound weariness washed over her, so heavy it was like a physical weight. For a moment, she allowed herself to lean against the wall, the rough-hewn planks pressing into her back. The darkness was complete, the silence broken only by the wind's scream and the labored breathing of the sick. She felt utterly and completely alone, an island in a black and frozen sea, just as a sliver of true despair began to prick at the edges of her resolve. She heard a sound, a heavy, rhythmic thumping from the front of the store. It was not the frantic knock of someone seeking aid. It was measured, powerful, and certain. She felt her way through the darkness, her hands trailing along the walls, until she reached the main store. She fumbled with the bolt and pulled the heavy door inward. Boone Calhoun stood on the porch, a human mountain against the swirling chaos of the storm. Snow clung to his hat and shoulders, and his face was barely visible in the gloom. In one hand, he held a lantern, its steady golden light a beacon in the oppressive dark. Over his other shoulder was a heavy burlap sack. He didn't speak. He simply stepped inside, bringing the light and a gust of frozen air with him, and shut the door, leaning his weight against it to block out the storm's fury. He set the lantern on the counter, its glow pushing the shadows back into the corners. Then he swung the sack from his shoulder and dropped it to the floor with a heavy thud. It was filled with freshly split, bone-dry firewood. Catherine stared at the sack, then at him. He was looking around the dark, cold store, his gaze finally settling on her. Ruth said your light was out. He said it was a simple statement of fact. The oil is gone, she replied, her voice sounding hoarse in her own ears. And my wood was low. He nodded, as if she had merely confirmed his own assessment. Kitchen's the warmest place, he said, echoing Ruth's words from the night of her arrival. He picked up the lantern and the sack of wood. It was not a suggestion. She followed him through the dark store, past shelves of unseen goods, to the boarding house. The kitchen was cold and lifeless, the great stove a black iron ghost in the corner. But Boone worked with a quiet efficiency that was mesmerizing to watch. He knelt and laid a fire with an expert hand, using kindling from the sack to coax a small flame to life. Soon, a cheerful blaze was crackling in the stove, its light dancing on the low beams of the ceiling. The room began to breathe again, to fill with a life-giving warmth. Catherine sank into a chair at the long wooden table, her exhaustion finally overwhelming her. She watched him, this large, quiet man who seemed to move through the world with such purpose, always seeing what was needed and providing it without a word of fuss. When the fire was roaring, he took the pot of stew that was always simmering on the back of Ruth's stove and moved it to the front to heat. He found 2 bowls and 2 spoons and set them on the table. He did all this without speaking, his movements economical and sure. The silence in the room was a living thing, a stark contrast to the howling rage of the wind outside. It was a silence that felt safe. He filled the bowls with a thick, fragrant stew and set one in front of her. Then he sat down opposite her, the table between them, the firelight casting flickering shadows on his rugged face. They ate. The only sounds were the clink of their spoons against the bowls and the storm's distant fury. When they were finished, he took the bowls to the wash basin, but he did not leave. He came back to the table and sat, nursing a tin cup of water, his gaze fixed on the fire. Catherine found herself studying his profile, the strong line of his jaw, the way the firelight caught the weathered creases around his eyes. She had been in this town for weeks, had worked alongside him in a silent partnership, and yet she knew nothing about him. The question rose in her unbidden, born of the strange intimacy of the storm-tossed night. "Are you always this quiet?" she asked, her voice soft. He didn't look at her. He continued to stare into the flames, considering her question as if it were a complex problem in need of a solution. The fire popped, sending a shower of sparks up the flue. Finally, he spoke, his voice a low rumble. Folks don't usually listen if you say something they don't want to hear. The simple, profound truth of his words struck her with the force of a physical blow. He had just articulated the central, painful lesson of her own life. She thought of Pastor Merrick and his congregation, of how they had refused to hear that a woman could be both skilled and strong without being unfeminine. They hadn't wanted to hear it, so they had cast her out. Boone's silence wasn't an absence of thought. It was a carefully constructed defense against a world that preferred comfortable lies to difficult truths. A small, sad smile touched her lips, the first genuine smile she had allowed herself in a very long time. It felt like a muscle she hadn't used in years. "What about me?" she asked, her voice barely a whisper. The question was a risk, a small piece of her own guarded heart laid bare on the table. Asterisk. Do you think I am one of them? Do you think I don't want to hear asterisk? This time, he turned his head and looked at her. The full force of his storm-colored eyes met hers across the table. The firelight danced in their depths. There was no artifice in his gaze, no guile, just a deep, unwavering stillness. "You ask," he said, "I'll answer." It was a promise, an oath, in that simple declaration. He was offering her something he offered no one else access. He was telling her that he saw her as separate from the rest of the world, as someone who would not flinch from the truth. He was giving her a key to the locked rooms of his soul. The weight of his words settled between them, more comforting than any blanket, warmer than any fire. The howling of the wind faded into a distant murmur. The vast, oppressive darkness no longer felt threatening. In the small, flickering circle of light in that quiet kitchen, two solitary souls had found a piece of common ground. Catherine held his gaze, and for the first time she did not feel the need to look away. She simply nodded, a slow acknowledgement of the gift he had just given her, and they sat there together in the warm, companionable silence, while the fire burned bright and the storm raged on outside. The grip of the long sickness finally broke with the weather. The relentless, oppressive gray skies gave way to a brilliant, piercing blue, and the town of Shady Hollow took its first collective, clean breath in over a month. The dead had been buried, the sick were mending, and a fragile, weary sense of normalcy began to knit the community back together. Catherine's infirmary in the back of the general store was now home to only one patient, an old trapper who was more stubborn than ill. Her days were no longer a frantic race against a fever, but a steady, quiet routine of changing dressings, doling out tonics, and watching the color slowly return to the faces of the children she had fought so hard for. She had earned the town's respect, but it was a brittle thing, the kind of respect afforded to a skilled but intimidating stranger. They were grateful for her hands, but they were still wary of the woman herself. She remained an outsider, a tall, solitary figure moving on the edges of their lives. One afternoon, the sun shining with a rare winter warmth that melted the top layer of snow into a glittering crust. She stepped outside for a breath of fresh air, the sound of children's laughter, a sound that had been absent for weeks, drew her gaze to the gentle slope behind the church. There, against the vast, white canvas of the hill was a scene of such simple, profound joy that it made her heart ache. Boone Calhoun was surrounded by a half-dozen of the town's children, including young Jacob, his leg now strong enough for him to run with only a slight limp. Boone had gathered scraps of wood wide, smoothed planks from a broken crate, and long, curved barrel staves, and was showing the children how to use them as sleds. He wasn't playing with them, not in the way a younger man might. He was an anchor, a quiet center of gravity around which their chaotic energy swirled. He'd demonstrate how to lie on a plank to get the best speed, his large frame looking almost comical on the small piece of wood. He'd offer a steadying hand to a smaller child, his stitched-up knuckles a stark contrast to their tiny, mittened fingers. His voice, when he spoke, was a low, calm murmur, and the children listened with a rapt attention they never gave their own parents. Catherine stood by the corner of the church, her arms wrapped around herself, an observer separated by an invisible wall. She watched as Boone sent a laughing little girl careening down the hill, her pigtails flying. She watched as Jacob, full of bravado, tried to stand on a barrel stave like a circus performer and ended up in a heap of tangled limbs, coming up sputtering with a mouthful of snow. Through it all, Boone was a solid, patient presence, his rare, small smile appearing only when a child managed a particularly long and successful run. A part of her, a part she had thought long dead, felt a sharp pang of longing. She had never been a part of such a scene, not even as a child. She had always been the tall, serious girl who preferred books to games, the young woman whose competence was mistaken for a lack of warmth. She was the healer, the caregiver, the one who stood apart and tended to the consequences of life, never the one who simply lived it. She must have been standing there for a long time, lost in thought, because suddenly Jacob was at her side, his face flushed with cold and excitement. "Nurse Catherine," he yelled, tugging on her sleeve. "Come try Boone made me the fastest sled." Catherine looked down at the boy she had pulled back from the brink. His eyes were bright, full of a simple, uncomplicated joy that she had almost forgotten existed. "Oh, no, Jacob, I couldn't. I'm just watching." Please," another little girl chimed in, grabbing her other hand. Soon, she was surrounded. Their small hands, insistent and warm, pulled at her coat, their voices a chorus of pleas. They were not intimidated by her height or her serious face. To them, she was simply the woman who had made them better, and they wanted to share their happiness with her. I'm not dressed for it," she stammered, a weak protest. But they were a force of nature, laughing and pulling. They half-dragged her toward the top of the slope where Boone stood watching, his expression unreadable. He held out a long, wide plank. "It's the most stable one," he said, his voice matter-of-fact. Before she could refuse, the children were upon her, a flurry of small bodies and cheerful commands. With a final, collective push, they sent her and the plank over the edge of the slope. The world dissolved into a dizzying rush of white and blue. The icy air tore at her face and whipped stray strands of hair from her braid. For a terrifying second, she felt a complete loss of control, a sensation she loathed. She was clumsy, awkward, her long limbs struggling to find purchase on the slick board. The sled tilted, caught an edge, and sent her tumbling into a deep, soft drift of powder snow. She came up sputtering, covered from head to toe in a thick white blanket, her hat askew. The children's laughter rained down on her from the top of the hill, high and sweet as sleigh bells. And then, something inside her broke. A bubble of pressure she had been holding in her chest for years, the pressure of grief, of loneliness, of constant, weary vigilance simply burst. A laugh escaped her lips. It wasn't a smile or a chuckle. It was a deep, full-throated, genuine laugh. A sound so unfamiliar it felt like it belonged to another woman. She laughed until tears streamed from her eyes, mixing with the melting snow on her cheeks. She laughed at the absurdity of it, at the children's delighted faces, at the feeling of the cold, clean snow on her skin. She laughed because for the first time in as long as she could remember, she felt utterly, weightlessly free. At the top of the hill, Boone stood perfectly still. He watched her, his head tilted slightly. He wasn't laughing. His face was serious, but the storm in his eyes had calmed as she finally pushed herself up, still chuckling. He gave a slow, deliberate nod. It was a small gesture, almost imperceptible, but it was filled with a profound sense of confirmation, as if he had just witnessed a crucial, long-awaited event that only he understood the significance of. They stayed until the sun began to dip below the jagged peaks of the mountains, painting the snow in hues of apricot and rose. The air grew sharp with the coming night, and the children, their energy finally spent, began to gather their things. As the little group trudged back toward the warm lights of the town, Catherine and Boone fell into step behind them, pulling the makeshift sleds by ropes of twine. The children's chatter faded as they ran ahead, leaving the two of them in a pocket of quiet. The only sound was the crunch of their boots on the snow and the soft hiss of the wooden planks dragging behind them. The world was beautiful and still, bathed in the ethereal twilight. Catherine felt a sense of peace so deep it was almost unnerving. She didn't want the moment to end. She didn't want to return to her solitary room, to the lonely woman she had always been. She looked at the man walking beside her, a solid, dependable shadow in the fading light. He had been the one to anchor her here. He had been the one to see her, truly see her. And now, she needed to know if this peace, this fragile warmth, was real. She stopped, and he stopped with her. She looked up at him, her heart beating a nervous, hopeful rhythm against her ribs. "Do we have time?" she asked, her voice barely more than a whisper. But the words were huge, freighted with all the unspoken questions. Asterisk time for this time for us. Is it too late for me to learn how to be a part of something asterisk? Boone looked down at her. His face was in shadow, but she could feel the intensity of his gaze. He understood everything she wasn't saying. He always did. He let the silence stretch for a moment, letting the weight of her question settle between them in the cold, still air. "All night," he said. His answer was a promise. It meant more than just the evening. It meant tomorrow. It meant there was no hurry. It meant that for her, he had all the time in the world. A tremor went through her, a shudder not of cold, but of profound, earth-shifting relief. Slowly, hesitantly, she reached out and laid her gloved hand on the worn leather of his forearm. It was a small, simple gesture, but it was a monumental crossing. His arm was solid and warm beneath her touch. She felt him tense for a fraction of a second, and then relax. Accepting the contact, she did not pull her hand away. For the first time with this man, she did not retreat into the safety of her own solitude. She held on, anchoring herself to him. As the last light of day faded from the sky and the first stars began to prick the deep, velvet darkness above them. The weeks that followed the first snow were a time of quiet healing, not just for the town, but for Catherine. The fragile peace she'd found on the snowy hill with Boone began to take root inside her. The touch of her hand on his arm had been a beginning, a silent acknowledgement that had blossomed into a gentle routine. They spoke little, but their shared language was one of action and presence. He would leave a stack of perfectly split firewood by her door. She would leave a hot plate of supper for him on the stove when he returned late. Sometimes they would sit at Ruth's long kitchen table in the evenings, the comfortable silence between them a world away from the strained quiet she had known her entire life. For the first time, Catherine felt the tentative, unfamiliar shape of hope. The hope was a fragile thing, a winter wildflower pushing its way through frozen ground. It was shattered by the arrival of a man on the noon stagecoach. News of a new pastor had been circulating for a week. The old one had succumbed to the grip in a neighboring town, and Shady Hollow, a small outpost of faith, was to be blessed with a temporary replacement to guide them through the Christmas season. Catherine paid the news little mind. The church, for her, was a locked room in her memory, a place of judgment she had no desire to revisit. She was in the general store, purchasing a new supply of bandages from Mr. Abernathy, when the man himself walked in. He was a tall, handsome man in his 40s, with a mane of silvering dark hair and a smile that seemed both warm and unnervingly confident. He moved with an easy grace, his black coat immaculate despite the muddy streets. The few customers in the store turned to him, their face lit with welcome. "A pleasure to make your acquaintance," the man said, his voice a rich, practiced baritone that filled the store. "Pastor Merrick, at your service." Catherine froze, her hand hovering over a bolt of clean linen. The name struck her like a physical blow, a fist of ice closing around her heart. The air in her lungs turned to stone. Slowly, as if moving through deep water, she turned. His eyes, a piercing, intelligent blue, swept the room and landed on her. For a fraction of a second, his polished smile faltered, a flicker of cold. Hard recognition passed through his gaze before being instantly replaced by a mask of polite curiosity. But she had seen it. He knew her. This was the man who had stood before a congregation in Arizona and branded her with the word prideful. He was the one who had twisted her competence into a sin, her quiet nature into a rejection of Christian fellowship. He had been the architect of her exile, and now the ghost of her past had walked into the one place she had started to feel safe. She turned back to the counter, her movements stiff. She paid Abernathy, her face a blank mask, and walked out of the store without a backward glance, but she could feel his eyes on her back. And she knew, with a certainty that chilled her to the bone, that her brief season of peace was over. The poison began to spread the very next day, not as a flood, but as a slow, insidious seep. Pastor Merrick was skilled. He did not denounce her from the pulpit. He worked in whispers, in carefully chosen words spoken with an air of regretful concern. He spoke to Ruth over a cup of tea, praising Catherine's medical skills before adding, with a sorrowful sigh, "A tragedy, isn't it, when such a God-given gift is housed in a spirit so closed off to His grace? I tried to guide her in Arizona, but her pride, it is a formidable fortress." He mentioned to the blacksmith, whose son Catherine had nursed back to health. A remarkable woman. So, self-reliant, we must pray she learns to lean on the Lord and her community, instead of trusting only in herself. To the women of the town, he painted a picture of a soul in peril, a woman whose refusal to be gentle and quiet in spirit was a sign of a deep inner turmoil. He never raised his voice. He never accused her of anything concrete. He simply planted seeds of doubt, watering them with his own unquestionable authority as a man of God. The town, which had finally begun to see Catherine for what she could do, was now being taught to see her for what she was not: pious, humble, soft. The old suspicions, which had never truly died, resurfaced. Conversations would halt when she entered a room. The easy greetings she had started to receive became hesitant, then stopped altogether. She was once again the outsider, the strange, tall woman who didn't fit. The wall of ice she had felt on her first day in Shady Hollow was rising around her again, brick by invisible brick. Through it all, Boone remained unchanged. He was a bulwark of granite against the shifting tides of public opinion. He saw the cold looks she received, the way the other boarders at Ruth's table would now fall silent when she sat down. He saw it, and he acted. One evening, as Catherine ate her supper in a silence that felt heavy enough to suffocate, Boone got up, retrieved the coffee pot, and refilled her cup before his own. He then sat back down, a little closer to her than before, and met the gazes of the other men at the table with a flat, challenging stare until they looked away, suddenly fascinated by their own plates. It was a small, silent act, but it was a public declaration. Asterisk, she is with me. He sought her out, making a point of walking with her from the boarding house to the store, his presence a shield against the whispers. He did not ask her about Merrick. He did not ask about Arizona. He seemed to understand that her past was a wound she could not bear to have touched. Instead, he offered his unwavering, unquestioning presence. He trusted what he knew of her, not what a smooth-tongued stranger claimed to know. His loyalty was a silent, steady anchor in the storm of rumor and judgment. As the days grew shorter and colder, the town began preparing for its annual winter festival, a celebration held on the Sunday before Christmas. It was the most important social event of the year, a time of carols, spiced cider, and community fellowship, culminating in a special service at the church. It was also, as Catherine knew, a mandatory performance of belonging. "You will come, of course," Ruth said to her one afternoon, her tone more of a plea than a question. "It would do you good, and it would show folks, well, it would show them. It would show them that she was willing to bend, to conform, that she would sit in a pew and listen to the words of the man who had destroyed her life, all for the sake of appearances." "I won't be attending," Catherine said, her voice quiet but firm. "Thank you for the thought, Ruth." Her refusal solidified her status as an outcast. To shun the winter festival was to shun the town itself. The night of the festival arrived, cold and clear, the sky littered with 1,000,000 diamond-sharp stars. From her small room at the boarding house, Catherine could hear the sounds of the town celebrating. She heard the distant, joyful peal of the church bell and the faint strains of a Christmas carol. Every note felt like a judgment. She had fought for this town, for its children, for its future. And they had, in the end, chosen the comforting words of a charismatic stranger over the evidence of her deeds. She sat on her bed in the darkness, the isolation a familiar, aching weight in her chest. A solid knock on her door made her jump. Not the front door of the house, but the door to her own room. She rose and opened it. Boone stood in the hallway, silhouetted by the lamplight from downstairs. He was dressed not in his work clothes, but in a clean shirt and his best coat. He looked taller, somehow, more solid than ever. He said nothing for a long moment, his storm-gray eyes taking in her plain dress and the stubborn, lonely set of her jaw. "It started," he said simply. "I know," she replied. "I'm not going." "I know," he said again. He understood. He did not try to persuade her or argue with her. He simply stood there, a silent witness to her pain. Then he did something that stopped her breath. He held out his hand, his large, calloused, scarred hand, the one she had stitched and tended. It was not a gesture of pity, but an offering of strength, an invitation. "Come with me," Boone said. His voice was low, but it cut through the darkness and the self-pity that had begun to curl around her heart. He was not asking her to go to the festival. He was not asking her to face the town or the pastor alone. He was asking her to go * with him, *, to stand beside him, to face the ghosts of her past, not as a solitary outcast, but as one half of a united front. She looked from his outstretched hand to his steady, waiting eyes. In their depths, she saw a promise *. "I will not let you fall *. The fear was still there, a cold knot in her stomach. But for the first time, it was not the only thing she felt. She also felt the profound, grounding weight of his loyalty. He was offering her a choice to remain a prisoner of her past in this dark, lonely room, or to walk into the light by his side. Slowly, she raised her own hand. It trembled slightly as she placed it in his. His fingers closed around hers, strong and warm and sure. Walking through the snow-dusted street of Shady Hollow, with Boone's hand holding hers, felt to Catherine like walking into a different life. His grip was not possessive or forceful. It was a simple, solid statement of fact. * We are together in this. The cold air was filled with the sounds of the festival, the distant swell of a fiddle, and the murmur of dozens of voices. With every step closer to the town hall, the knot of fear in Catherine's stomach tightened. She was walking willingly back into the courthouse of public opinion, to face the very judge who had sentenced her once before. But this time was different. She was not alone. Boone's presence beside her was a silent, grounding force. He did not speak, did not offer words of encouragement. He did not need to. His presence was the encouragement. It was the quiet, unshakable belief of one good person. And she found it was a more formidable shield than any wall she had ever built around herself. The town hall was ablaze with light and life. Lanterns were strung from the rafters, casting a warm, golden glow over the crowded room. A long table groaned under the weight of pies, baked hams, and pots of steaming beans. In one corner, a trio of musicians sawed away at a cheerful reel. The air was thick with the scent of pine, cinnamon, and roasting meat. It was a picture of perfect community, a world she had only ever observed from the outside. The moment they stepped through the doorway, a hush fell over the room. The fiddle wavered and then stopped. Conversations died in mid-sentence. Every head turned in their direction. It was as if two figures from a different, wilder world had just stepped into their tame and brightly lit celebration. They saw Boone Calhoun, a man they knew but had never truly understood, his usual solitary nature now abandoned. And they saw the tall nurse, the woman who had saved their children, walking beside him. Her head held high, her hand held firmly in his. She was not hiding behind him. She was his equal, a matched peak in a mountain range of two. The whispers started immediately, a low hiss that spread through the crowd like fire in dry grass. Catherine felt the weight of 100 pairs of eyes on her, dissecting her, judging her. The old instinct to shrink, to make herself smaller, to retreat, screamed within her. But Boone's hand was a warm, steady anchor, and she squeezed it, drawing strength from him. She kept her back straight and her gaze level, meeting the stares of the townsfolk without flinching. Then she saw him. Pastor Merrick was standing near the hearth, a cup of cider in his hand, a benevolent smile on his handsome face. He was the center of attention, the shepherd tending to his flock. When he saw them, his smile did not falter, but his eyes hardened with a cold, triumphant light. This was the moment he had been waiting for. This public challenge to his narrative could not go unanswered. He set his cup down and began to move toward them, parting the crowd like a ship through water. The townsfolk stepped back, clearing a space, turning the center of the hall into a stage. The air grew thick with anticipation. Catherine could feel her heart hammering against her ribs, a frantic bird trapped in a cage. Merrick stopped a few feet in front of them, his expression a perfect blend of pastoral concern and sorrowful disappointment. He looked only at Catherine, dismissing Boone as if he were a piece of furniture. "Sister Catherine," he said, his rich baritone voice filling the silent hall. He intentionally used the title from their old church, a subtle reminder of her past and his authority over it. "We are all so glad you reconsidered your seclusion. It is a blessing to see you joining our fellowship tonight." He let the words hang in the air before delivering his true blow. He raised his voice, ensuring every person in the room could hear his question, his public inquisition. "Tell us, sister," he boomed, his voice dripping with false piety. "Have you finally had a change of heart?" The question was a perfectly crafted trap. A yes would be an admission of her own sinfulness, a validation of everything he had said about her. It would be a surrender. A no would be a confirmation of her unrepentant pride, a slap in the face to the town and its faith. The crowd held its breath, waiting for her to stumble, to falter, to be ensnared. Catherine felt a moment of pure, cold terror. The ghosts of Arizona swirled around her, their whispers echoing Merrick's condemnation. She could feel Boone's thumb move slightly over the back of her hand, a small, grounding gesture that cut through the panic. He was there. He was not moving. He was waiting for her to speak her truth. She looked past the pastor's smug, expectant face and let her gaze sweep over the crowd. She saw the faces of the children she had healed. She saw the blacksmith, whose hand she had bandaged after a bad burn. She saw Mrs. Gable, whose lungs she had cleared, sitting frail but breathing easy in a chair by the wall. She had served this town. She had cared for its people. Her deeds were her testimony. She drew a slow, steadying breath and looked directly into Pastor Merrick's eyes. The fear was gone, replaced by a cold, clear certainty. "Pastor," she said, her voice not loud, but carrying with a calm, unwavering clarity that cut through the silence. "I have never needed to change my heart to be a kind person." The words were simple, direct, and utterly devastating to his attack. She had not taken the bait. She had refused his terms, sidestepped his trap, and offered a more profound truth in its place. She was not speaking of piety or grace or submission. She was speaking of fundamental human decency, a quality the town had witnessed in her for weeks. She was stating, without pride or arrogance, that her core self had never been the thing that was broken. A collective, muffled sound went through the crowd, a gasp, a murmur, a shifting of weight. They looked from Catherine's resolute face to their pastor's. For the first time, a crack appeared in his polished veneer. A flicker of raw fury showed in his eyes before he masked it with a pained smile. He had lost. He had swung his sword, and she had refused to be cut by it. He had tried to shame her, and she had refused to feel shame. It was then that Boone moved. He had remained a silent statue beside her during the entire exchange. But now, a slow smile spread across his face. It was not the small ghost of a smile she had seen once before. This was a true, genuine smile, a rare and startlingly handsome thing that lit up his rugged features. It was a smile of pure, unadulterated pride. Without taking his eyes off Catherine, he released her hand, stepped over to the refreshment table, and returned with 2 steaming mugs of hot, spiced cider. He handed one to her. "You look cold," he said, his voice a low, intimate rumble meant only for her. She took the mug, its warmth seeping into her trembling fingers. The simple, domestic act broke the spell that had held the room captive. The fiddle player, taking his cue, struck up a hesitant tune. Conversation slowly, awkwardly, began to resume. The crisis had passed. Catherine stood in the middle of the room, Boone at her side, the warm, sweet scent of cider rising to her face. People still looked at her, but the stares were different now. The suspicion was mingled with a new, grudging respect. Some, like Ruth, even offered her a small, approving nod from across the room. She took a sip of the cider, the warmth spreading through her chest, chasing away the last of the chill. She looked at Boone, who was watching her with that same proud smile. In this moment, surrounded by the light and the noise of the town, she felt more at peace than she ever had in the deepest solitude. She stood tall, her shoulders back, her chin high. The rejection she had feared her entire life was no longer a wound. The judgment of others no longer held any power. She did not need to bow her head ever again. The confrontation at the winter festival marked a subtle but profound shift in the town's climate. Pastor Merrick's influence had been checked by a simple, undeniable truth, and the townsfolk, while not openly defying him, began to treat Catherine with a quiet, watchful respect. The fear in their eyes was replaced by a kind of awe. She was still a strange, formidable woman, but she was strange, formidable woman. The fragile peace she had found with Boone solidified into something strong and real, a silent understanding that needed no words. For the first time, Catherine allowed herself to think that she might have found a place to stop running. But the mountains were indifferent to the small dramas of men. They were a place of brutal, unpredictable power, and they were not yet done with the people of Shady Hollow. The storm came without warning. One afternoon, the sky turned the color of a leaden bruise, and the wind began to howl a low, mournful note that quickly rose to a malevolent shriek. It was not a normal snowstorm. It was a blizzard, a white fury that descended from the peaks and swallowed the world whole. Snow did not fall. It flew horizontally, a blinding, stinging curtain that erased the lines between earth and sky. Within an hour, Shady Hollow was buried, its buildings little more than snow-dusted humps in a sea of churning white. Boone had ridden out that morning for the northern logging camp, a routine 2-day trip. As the storm raged into its second day with no sign of abating, a knot of cold, hard fear began to form in Catherine's belly. Late that afternoon, a figure stumbled into Ruth's boarding house, half frozen and covered in ice. It was a young logger named Silas, who had left the camp just as the storm hit, trying to outrun it. "The whole camp snowed in," he stammered through chattering teeth as Ruth and Catherine wrapped him in blankets by the fire. "Drifts are 20 feet high. We're cut off." He looked around the room, his eyes wild with fear. "Boone Calhoun. He left yesterday, before the worst of it. He was checking traps on the western ridge. He never came back to camp." The room fell silent. Everyone knew what that meant. The western ridge was a treacherous, exposed spine of rock and pine. To be caught there in a storm like this was a death sentence. A few of the men exchanged grim, hopeless glances. It was a tragedy, but there was nothing to be done. No one could travel in this. Catherine felt the blood drain from her face, a roaring in her ears that was louder than the wind outside. The carefully constructed peace of the last few weeks shattered into a million pieces. All she could see was Boone's face, his storm-colored eyes, his rare, proud smile. The thought of that steady, quiet light being extinguished by the indifferent cold was more than she could bear. While the other men were shaking their heads and murmuring about waiting for the storm to break, Catherine was already moving. She strode into her infirmary and began filling a leather satchel, her movements swift and sure. She packed bandages, salves, a bottle of laudanum, and another of strong whiskey. She grabbed her warmest woolens, a tinderbox, and a small, sharp hatchet. Ruth followed her, her old face creased with worry. "Child, what are you doing? You can't go out in that." "He's alive," Catherine said, her voice a low, fierce command. It was not a hope. It was a statement of absolute fact. She would not allow the world to be otherwise. "I am going to find him." The men in the main room stared at her as if she'd gone mad. But Catherine's gaze fell on Eli, the blacksmith's lanky 17-year-old son, a boy whose younger sister she had nursed through the worst of the grip. He was strong, knew the woods, and possessed a quiet courage that reminded her a little of Boone himself. "Eli," she said, her tone leaving no room for argument, "you know the trail to the western ridge better than anyone. Get your snowshoes and 2 horses from the livery, the strongest ones. We leave in 10 minutes. The boy looked at his father, who gave a slow, grave nod. He owed this woman a debt. Without a word, Eli pulled on his coat and headed out into the blizzard. The journey was a descent into a frozen hell. The world was a formless, roaring chaos of white. The wind was a physical force, a solid wall that pushed and tore at them, stealing the breath from their lungs and freezing the moisture in their eyes. Catherine bent low over her horse's neck, her face wrapped in a scarf until only a narrow slit was visible. She did not feel the cold. She did not feel the exhaustion. She felt only a single, burning purpose that drove her forward, asterisk. Find him, asterisk. Eli was a masterful guide, navigating by some deep, instinctual knowledge of the land. For hours, they pushed through drifts that came up to their horses' chests. Twice, Eli's horse stumbled and fell, and they had to fight to get the panicked animal back on its feet. Any sane person would have turned back, but Catherine's iron will was a tangible thing, a force that seemed to pull the boy along in her wake. Near dusk, with the light failing and the storm showing no mercy, Eli pointed with a mittened hand. His horse, he shouted over the wind. The animal was half buried in a drift near a small stand of pines, shivering but alive. But Boone was nowhere to be seen. A wave of despair, cold and sharp as an icicle, pierced Catherine's resolve. But then she saw it, a faint, almost imperceptible wisp of gray smoke, torn to shreds instantly by the wind, coming from a rock outcropping 100 yards away. They found him there, with his last reserves of strength. He had built a small lean-to against the rock face, using fallen pine boughs to create a crude but effective shelter from the wind. Inside, a tiny fire, no bigger than a man's hand, was struggling for life. Boone lay beside it, wrapped in his bedroll. His face was pale and gaunt, his lips cracked and blue with cold. His axe lay beside him, and she saw a dark, frozen stain of blood on his trouser leg near the knee. He was alive, but his life was guttering like the small, precious fire he had built. "Get the horses under the trees," Catherine commanded Eli, her voice once again the steady, calm voice of the nurse. "Gather all the dry wood you can find." She knelt beside Boone, pulling off her gloves. Her hands, though numb with cold, went to work. She felt his neck. His pulse was weak and thready. She cut away the frozen fabric of his trousers. He had a deep, jagged gash on his leg, a wound from his axe, likely when he had been felling branches in his exhausted state. He had managed to wrap it, but it was a clumsy job. Working quickly, she and Eli built up the fire until it was a roaring blaze. Pushing back the oppressive cold, they stripped Boone of his wet outer layers and wrapped him in dry blankets. Catherine cleaned and stitched his wound by the dancing firelight, her movements as steady and sure as they had been in the warmth of her infirmary. She forced hot broth, laced with whiskey, between his lips. For hours, she worked over him, a silent, desperate battle against the cold that had seeped into his very bones. Eli, his young face etched with awe, kept the fire fed, creating a small sanctuary of warmth and light in the heart of the raging blizzard. Sometime deep in the night, Boone stirred, his eyes, hazy with fever and exhaustion, fluttered open. He looked around, disoriented, before his gaze settled on her face. Illuminated by the fire, he seemed to look right through her, his eyes focused on something far away. "Thought I was done for," he whispered, his voice a dry, hoarse rasp. "Froze to death on that ridge." "You are not done," Catherine said softly, placing a hand on his forehead. He was warm now, too warm. The fever was setting in. "Rest. You are safe." He seemed to register her presence then, his eyes focused on her, and a look of profound, heart-wrenching anguish passed over his face. He reached out a trembling hand, not to touch her, but as if reaching for a dream. "Thought I was going to die," he whispered again, his voice cracking with an emotion she had never heard from him before. "Die without saying it." Catherine leaned closer, her heart aching. "Saying what? Boone." He drew a ragged, shuddering breath. The firelight played in his storm-colored eyes, and in their depths she saw a vulnerability so raw and deep it took her breath away. All the walls were gone, washed away by the nearness of death. All that was left was the man, stripped bare to his soul. "I need you, Catherine," he breathed, the words a final, desperate confession. "I need you." It was not a declaration of love, not a romantic plea. It was something far more fundamental. It was an admission from a man who had never admitted to needing anything or anyone that she was essential to his existence, as necessary as air, as warmth, as life itself. Tears she did not know she possessed welled in her eyes, freezing instantly on her cheeks. She took his hand, his rough, calloused fingers cold in hers, and held it tight. She could not speak past the lump in her throat. She could only look at him, her entire being pouring into her gaze. He searched her face, looking for an answer. She gave it to him. She leaned down, her lips close to his ear, and whispered the only two words that mattered. The only two words that could meet the immensity of his confession. A vow, a promise, an anchor in the storm. I am here. The blizzard broke on the third day, its fury spent. The sky that emerged was a high, aching blue, and the world was reborn, sculpted into a new and silent geography of immense, glittering white drifts. It was into this transformed world that they returned. The sight of them emerging from the snow-choked northern trail stopped the town of Shady Hollow in its tracks. First came Eli, leading the two exhausted horses. Then came Catherine, her tall frame unbowed, her face raw from the wind but her eyes clear and determined. Behind her, dragged on a makeshift travois of pine boughs, was Boone Calhoun, injured and feverish, but alive. People came out of their houses and the general store, their mouths agape. They had written Boone off as dead, another soul claimed by the brutal indifference of the mountains. They had watched this strange, tall woman and a boy of 17 walk into the teeth of a killer storm, an act they had considered a fool's errand, a gesture of madness. And now, they were back. She had gone into the white heart of death itself and had returned with one of their own. It was more than an act of healing. It was an act of raw, primal loyalty that no one in the town could comprehend or deny. It was a sermon delivered not with words, but with frozen hands, an iron will, and a courage that shamed them all. The following days were a blur of quiet, focused care. Catherine installed Boone in her own room at the boarding house, seating her bed and taking a small pallet on the floor. She did not leave his side. She tended to the fever that racked his body, bathing his forehead with cool water and forcing broth and willow bark tea between his cracked lips. The deep gash in his leg, cleaned and stitched by firelight in the heart of the storm, was healing cleanly, a testament to her skill even under the most impossible conditions. And the town watched. Their previous whispers of suspicion and judgment had vanished, replaced by a profound and humbling silence. They saw the light in her window burning all through the night. They saw young Eli, now a man in the town's eyes, bringing her fresh water and firewood, his face filled with a hero worship that was absolute. They saw Ruth guarding the hallway to the room like a loyal sentinel, turning away anyone who might disturb them. The change in the town's demeanor toward Catherine was not a sudden flood, but a slow, powerful tide turning. It began with shame. They remembered their cold shoulders, their whispers fueled by Pastor Merrick's insidious words. They remembered how they had judged her for not being soft, for not being small, for not being like them. And then they looked at what she had done. She had faced down the grip. She had faced down their judgment, and she had faced down a blizzard that would have killed any man among them. Their small-mindedness was laid bare in the light of her immense strength, and they were deeply ashamed. The first offering of peace came from the blacksmith, Eli's father. He appeared at the boarding house door not with a sick child, but with a beautifully wrought iron poker for her fireplace, its handle shaped into a simple, elegant leaf. He said nothing, just pressed it into her hands, met her eyes with a look of profound gratitude, and left. Soon, others followed. A woman who had once turned her back on Catherine in the street now appeared with a freshly baked loaf of bread, still warm from the oven. "For your strength," she mumbled, unable to meet Catherine's gaze for long. Another left a jar of preserved peaches on the porch. These were not payments. They were apologies. They were quiet admissions of their own failing. The most telling shift was in the nature of the requests. They no longer sought her out only in moments of desperate illness. One afternoon, a young woman approached her, clutching a man's shirt, its sleeve torn nearly off. "I saw you stitching up Boone's leg that first night," she said, her voice barely a whisper. "My own stitches are so clumsy. I was wondering if you might show me how." Catherine, standing on the porch for a breath of fresh air, looked at the torn shirt, then at the young woman's hopeful, nervous face. This was not a request for a servant's work. It was an invitation. It was an attempt to draw her into the domestic, everyday fabric of their community, to acknowledge that her skills were not just for moments of life and death, but for the small acts of mending that held a life together. Catherine took the shirt. She said, "Come inside." Meanwhile, Pastor Merrick found his position in the town untenable. His words, once so powerful, now rang hollow. He had spoken of fellowship and Christian charity, but it was the silent, shunned nurse who had practiced it in its most elemental form. His congregation grew smaller. The greetings he received on the street became cooler. The moral authority he had wielded so effortlessly had evaporated. The town had chosen its own savior, and it was not him. A quiet delegation, led by the blacksmith, sent a letter to the regional church authorities. Within 2 weeks, Pastor Merrick was gone, transferred to a distant parish. His departure as quiet and unlamented as his arrival had been celebrated. As Boone's strength returned, a new routine settled over them. The back room of the general store was no longer sufficient, with the town's quiet support. Catherine took over a small, abandoned cabin at the edge of the main street. The blacksmith replaced its broken windows. The store owner provided shelves and glass bottles, and Catherine's infirmary became a proper apothecary, a permanent fixture in the town, a place of healing, a place of her own. At the same time, Boone, limping but relentless, began the work of rebuilding the town's livery and stables, which had been badly damaged in the storm. Day after day, the sound of his hammer echoed through the town, a steady, rhythmic counterpoint to the quiet scrape of Catherine's mortar and pestle. He was rebuilding a place of shelter for the town's animals. She was maintaining a place of shelter for its people. Without a single word of planning, they were rebuilding the heart of Shady Hollow, each to their own trade, their purposes intertwined. Their life together was forged in the evenings. After a long day of work, she would return to the boarding house to find him there, waiting. Ruth would leave their supper on the stove, and they would sit at the long kitchen table, just the two of them in the warm, fire-lit quiet. Their conversations were sparse, made up of simple, practical things. The gray mare is favoring her left foreleg. He might say, "I'll look at it in the morning." She would reply, "Old Mrs. Gable needs more of her lung tonic." She would mention, "I'll drop it off on my way to the lumber camp." He would answer. But the real conversation happened in the spaces between the words. It happened in the quiet understanding that passed between them in a single glance. It happened, most of all, in the small, unconscious gestures of domestic life. Their hands would brush as he passed her the salt, a fleeting touch that sent a current of warmth through her. She would refill his coffee cup, her arm moving close to his shoulder, and she would feel him lean into her presence, a subtle shift of weight that was a confession of comfort. When he handed her the basket of bread, his fingers would linger on hers for a fraction of a second longer than necessary. These small, repeated contacts were a language all their own, a language of deep and abiding intimacy that required no sound. It was a conversation of touch that spoke of trust, of comfort, of a shared life being built one quiet evening at a time. It was the language of two solitary people who had, against all odds, found their way home to each other, communicating not in grand declarations, but in the simple, profound gesture of passing a bowl from his hands to hers. Winter had returned to Shady Hollow not with the violent fury of the blizzard, but with a gentle, persistent quiet. For days, a thick, silent snow had been falling, a curtain of white that muffled all sound and softened the hard edges of the world. It buried the muddy street, draped the pines in heavy ermine cloaks, and pressed against the window panes of Ruth's boarding house like a curious ghost. The world had shrunk, its vast, intimidating wilderness tamed and quieted, its focus drawn inward to the warm, glowing heart of the town's hearths. Inside the kitchen, a fire roared in the great iron stove, its cheerful crackle the only sound in the warm, still air. The room smelled of baking bread, drying wool, and the faint, clean scent of pine from the wood box. Catherine stood before the window, one hand resting on the cool glass, watching the endless, mesmerizing cascade of flakes. Each one was a tiny, perfect star, a fragile piece of beauty in a world that had so often shown her its ugliness. She was not the same woman who had arrived in this town months ago. The constant, gnawing tension that had lived in her shoulders for years had finally uncoiled. The walls she had so carefully built around her heart had not been torn down in a violent assault, but had been gently dismantled, stone by quiet stone, by the steady, unassuming presence of one man. Here, in this small, snowbound town, she had done more than survive. She had put down roots. The apothecary was thriving, a testament to her skill. The townspeople treated her with a deference that had warmed into a genuine, if still slightly awed, affection. She had a place. She belonged. And yet, there was a final door, deep inside her, that remained unopened. A question that hung in the quiet spaces between her and Boone. Unspoken, but ever present. They lived in a comfortable, intimate orbit around each other, a shared life of work and quiet evenings. But they had never crossed the final, terrifying threshold. The memory of his confession in the storm asterisk, "I need you" asterisk, was a constant, glowing ember in her heart. But in the light of day, with his health returned, he had retreated back into the safety of his quietude, and she had been too afraid to ask for more. She heard the soft creak of a floorboard behind her and knew, without turning, that he had entered the room. He moved with a quietness that was remarkable for a man of his size, a stillness that was a part of the landscape itself. She did not turn, but continued to watch the snow, her breath misting the glass. She felt his presence behind her, a column of warmth and solid strength. She felt his nearness as a change in the very air she was breathing. Then, she felt his hands. They came to rest on her shoulders, large and warm, his calloused palms molding perfectly to the wool of her dress. The touch was not tentative. It was firm, certain, and possessive in a way that made her heart stop and then restart with a powerful, heavy beat. He stood behind her, his hands on her shoulders. For a long, silent moment, she could feel the heat of his body, the faint, clean scent of cold air and wood smoke that always clung to him. He was a mountain at her back, shielding her from the cold world outside the window. When he finally spoke, his voice was a low rumble, so close to her ear that she felt the vibration of it through her whole body. "I'm not good with sweet words, Catherine." His voice was rough, unused to such confessions. It was the voice of a man who spoke in deeds, not declarations. The admission was so quintessentially him that a small, tremulous smile touched her lips. She waited, her entire being focused on the space between them. "But I know what I want," he finished. The words were simple, stripped of all artifice, but they held the weight of his entire soul. They were the culmination of every shared silence, every fleeting touch, every quiet act of loyalty and care. He was a man who had spent his life wanting little and needing less. And now, he was making the single most important declaration of his life. Slowly, she turned in the circle of his arms to face him. His hands did not leave her shoulders but tightened their grip, holding her steady. She had to tilt her head back to look up into his face. In the flickering firelight, his features were carved into stark relief, the rugged lines of his jaw, the weathered creases around his eyes, and those eyes the color of a storm, but clear now, and filled with a raw, terrifying honesty, were fixed on hers. She asked the question that had been living in her heart for months, the question whose answer she already knew but needed, desperately, to hear spoken aloud. Her voice was barely a whisper against the crackle of the fire. "What do you want, Boone?" He did not hesitate. He did not look away. His gaze held hers, a direct, unwavering line of truth between them. He said the single word that held everything: her past, her future, her strength, her solitude, her fears, and her hopes. Everything she was, everything she had ever been. You. The word landed in the quiet room not with a crash, but with the profound, earth-shaking silence of a mountain settling into its foundations. It was the simplest and most complete of answers. He did not want her to be softer, or smaller, or quieter. He did not want a piece of her, the skilled nurse or the quiet companion. He wanted all of her. He wanted Catherine. A deep, shuddering breath escaped her lips. There were no words that could answer such a declaration. Words were weak, inadequate things. Words were for men like Pastor Merrick, tools of persuasion and deceit. Boone had offered her a truth that was beyond language, and she would answer him in kind. She looked into his eyes and let him see everything that was in her heart, the gratitude, the relief, the deep, soul-shaking love she had been too afraid to name. And then, with a slow, deliberate movement, she let the heavy woolen shawl she wore for warmth slip from her shoulders. It fell without a sound, pooling in a dark circle at her feet on the warm, wooden floor. It was the shedding of the last of her armor, the final, wordless surrender of a heart that had been guarded for a lifetime. It was an act of absolute trust, an invitation, and a vow. An answer more powerful than any yes. A new light kindled in Boone's eyes, a fire that matched the one in the stove. He lowered his head, and the long, cold winter that had defined both their lives, the lonely winters of the soul, finally, blessedly, came to an end. In the heart of the snowbound mountains, in the warm, golden light of the fire, they found their home. Thank you for listening to our story. We'd love to know where in the world you're tuning in from, so please leave a comment below to say hello and share your thoughts. If you enjoyed this tale, please subscribe to our channel, Wild West Stories 1850, and give this video a like. And to help this story reach more listeners, please consider supporting us by hitting the hype button. We appreciate every one of you.